Ora então, boa tarde a todos. I'm going to change to English because our invite is from America, so we're going to speak in English. Welcome to all. Welcome to the University of Aveiro. Welcome to Fábrica Viva Science Center. First of all, I want to thank all of people that is here in this event, Open Talk. And of course, I want to thank to Bruce Lewenstein to accept our invitation to come to Portugal to spend 2 weeks and to give to work with us and to give this open lecture. Bruce, thank you very much. And I just want to say I'm not going to present Bruce. Cecilia is going to present Bruce in detail. And I just want to say that this open talk is inside the program of 2 weeks program, as you may know, from a Fulbright program, where we invite Bruce Lewenstein, as a specialist in public communication and public engagement into science and technology. This program was a challenge that the research unit of Education and Psychology Department, CDETFF, made us, strange name, made to Fábrica, made to us, to be partners in this proposal. And then we work together in this proposal. This proposal is focused on the communication of science and technology in education. And we have a mixed program relating science communication, science centers, and science communication and science education. So that's been 1 full week of lots of work. We have this one starting now with workshops, internal workshops, project planning, and we have been between the Department of Education, the Fábrica Science Center. So that is, of course, a big opportunity to our university and to our science center to collaborate with the University of Cornell and with Bruce and other colleagues, and maybe to start a more long collaboration between our entities and our groups. So now I pass the word to Cecilia Guerra. That was the person, Cecilia Guerra and António Moreira, that made this challenge to me and to Fábrica. António Moreira couldn't come here, but he's seeing on website on the YouTube live. So hello, and Cecilia is going to present Professor Bruce Lewenstein.
So the difficult task. So good afternoon. Professor Bruce Lewenstein is an expert on public communication of science and technology. Bruce is professor at the Department of Communication at the University of Cornell. Cornell is situated in Ithaca, New York, and is one of the 8 universities belonging to the Ivy League in the United States of America. Bruce's background is a historian of science, and he used historical case studies in his research. In recent years, it has helped connect the public communication field with learning science field, especially around issues of public engagement in science. He has done work evaluating citizen science outreach projects in which citizens fully participate in scientific process by gathering, entering, and analyzing scientific data. We, once again, would like to thank you for accepting our invitation. This open talk will be an opportunity to learn more about public communication of science and technology in education. Thank you very much.
Obrigado.
Okay, Bruce, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Obrigado. Obrigado. Thank you so much for that kind invitation. You should know that I know the Ivy League is famous, and we're one of the 8 universities there. We're proud. The Ivy League is actually a collection of athletic schools. It's a particular athletic grouping. It actually has nothing to do with our academics, but that's okay. We're prestigious. So this is the second time that I have been on this stage, and I was here 8 years ago at the invitation of Pedro Pombo when I was at a meeting in Porto. I'm very glad to be back here in Aveiro. It's been a real pleasure the week that I've been here. And I do want to thank all of the sponsors, particularly the Department of Education and Psychology, and within it, the CIDTFF. I won't even try to say that. And Fábrica, but also especially the Fulbright Commission, which is funding a major part of my visit here. I forgot to show you actually in the previous slide. Which one was the previous slide? You can see the American flag. It was the American Embassy that paid for my last trip, my last visit here. I also need to apologize for the fact that I'm speaking in English, that obrigado and bom dia is about as all I can say in Portuguese. And yet, different languages really are important in science. A former postdoc at Cornell, which one is the button for showing? The last one. There we go. Ana Maria Porras was one of the co-authors of this article about different languages, and has shown how much science we're missing when we only speak in English. So I think it's important to, as you're thinking about what I say, you'll obviously have to think in English while I'm speaking, but also try to think in Portuguese and think about how some of these ideas might look different or sound different, and maybe even go in a different direction as we speak in multiple languages. Okay, so what am I doing today? So today I said we're going to talk about the past, present, and future of public engagement. But as you heard in the introduction, we're already using different terms. They talked about science communication as being the area that they're trying to do work in. Cecilia mentioned that I have worked in the learning sciences, and in particular in a field called learning science in informal environments. That's actually what my talk was about in 2014. So one of the challenges as we think about the history of these fields, the past, is to understand where they come from, what the boundaries are, whether there are boundaries, and how we can try to think of the relationship between all of these different fields. So to begin, let me just give an introduction to the present, to what we think of today as being in this field. These are the places where you go for information if you are not a scientist, but you are interested in science. You go to the newspaper, different newspapers, maybe you go to a website that specializes in science like Discovery. Maybe you're interested more in literature about science, so you go to a site called lablit.com, which is short stories about being in a laboratory. Mostly this is information, and people would typically call this the communication side. Personally, I like to call it public communication of science and technology, not just science communication. You'll see why in a minute. I want to focus on the public side, but it's certainly in any case the science communication end of things. We also have a lot of activities that people talk about, often with the label of public engagement. Many of these are still relatively static. So they are sites like Facebook sites about science. It's a very rude word in English, so I won't say it, that particular site. But it's actually one of the most popular science sites on the internet. Or Brain Scoop, which for many years was a YouTube series produced at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, in which a researcher would go visit, or a communicator would go visit a lab and find all kinds of interesting, fun things there. But there was interaction in the comments section, but it was mostly still producing information. I like to feature Bill Nye the Science Guy. He got his first degree at Cornell, our university, so we're proud of him. That was 35 years ago. No, 45 years ago that he got his degree. But he still comes and visits. I saw him on campus just before I came here to Portugal. But again, what he's doing is educational TV. It's about teaching people things or entertaining them. And people use the term public engagement, but what they really mean is educational engagement. I want people to be excited. I want people to learn because excitement is part of learning. So we use public engagement and we call things like this public engagement, but really they are much more about engaging in the sense of being excited. We also have, in many places around the world, science festivals, an entire week where a city may be, instead of a literature festival or an arts festival, they'll have a science festival. And there will be crowds and crowds of people going to booths, many of them with those educational activities, or there will be special lectures or special events. I'm sure that if there were a science festival here in Aveiro, Fábrica would have booths there, so you could do hands-on things outside the museum. Some of those are intended for large crowds. Some of them are pitched at a higher level. So the World Science Festival, which is held in New York, is really pitched not at big crowds, but at the intellectuals, at the people who already have a college education, maybe even a graduate degree. So they'll engage in a different level of discussion, but it's still intended for many, many people. Many of these kinds of public engagement activities will include some kind of discussion. So often something that is called usually a science cafe. How many people here know what a science cafe is? Most people have a sense of it, right? It's somebody giving a talk, but instead of standing up here at the table, you're all sitting at coffee tables or maybe at a bar. Sometimes it's called science on tap or science at the bar. And there's much more give and take and discussion. That adds a dimension to the public engagement, this idea of some kind of discussion. Sometimes the discussion becomes even deeper. And this is where public engagement is about participation in science. So public engagement means bringing people into the process of science. So we have at the top some people doing some land planning in the northern part of Canada, where they need the people who are what Canadians call First Nations people, Native Americans who have lived there for hundreds or thousands of years, bring their knowledge into the discussion about land planning and to land use. So that's a place where you recognize that there is knowledge held by the community that the scientists may not have, and that you need to bring that in. This one about cancer clusters has to do with communities where there's a cluster of cancer cases that doesn't quite meet the standards of statistical significance. So technically, the scientists will say there's no problem there, but everybody in the community says, look, why do we suddenly have a cluster of cancer cases here? And we know that our kids go and play in where there used to be a chemical factory, and now those are the kids who are getting sick. And so you have the community driving a discussion about what's causing a problem and where do we get our knowledge. Sometimes you bring publics into discussions about public policy issues. So this picture here, in the US, NASA, the space agency convened public discussions about, if we find out that a large meteor is on track to hit the Earth, what should we do? And that's not simply a technical question, right? That's partly a public policy discussion about how much warning do we give people? Would we use a nuclear weapon to try to destroy something, given all the worries we have about nuclear weapons? And of course, that discussion was held before the week that we are in, where the use of nuclear weapons is literally on the table in Ukraine and Russia. So you would have these kinds of input into the policy discussions and recognizing that a lot of science isn't just the technical science, but it's also about politics and about funding and about legal issues and about geography and human history, and all of those things come together. That's a much different kind of public engagement than go have fun at Fábrica with the hands-on science activities. But we call both of those public engagement. So part of the challenge as we talk about this is to recognize this big scope of things that's all about public engagement. Oftentimes, we also need to think about it over time. So that's my oldest son. When he was about 12 years old, not surprisingly, I took him to a lot of science museums and his two brothers. He's a web designer now, right? He doesn't do anything with electronics hands-on like that. But for him, the idea that you go to someplace that's science-oriented for fun with your family is a routine thing. So now that he has two children of his own, that's him with my first grandson, who before he was a year old had already gone to a science museum, right? Because in that family, that's part of the tradition. That's my grandson, the same one, about 2 weeks ago at the Exploratorium in San Francisco, famous science museum there, right? He does it on his own now. That's where he wants to go for fun. But notice he's now at the stage where it's not just something for fun. He's now at the stage, he's 3.5, he's beginning to explore, to learn, to get ideas about things, in this case about bubbles and surface tension and things like that. So this family dimension adds both a social piece to public engagement and talking about it, that we do this collectively with our friends, with our families, but it also adds a learning piece. So this brings in that learning science in informal environments idea. Whoops, let's see, here we go. And this is the report that I talked about when I was here 8 years ago, called Learning Science in Informal Environments. I won't go through that whole talk again, but the important thing is that as we think about what does it mean to learn science, items 2 through 5 are what we usually think of. You learn the content of science, you learn the methods of science, you learn to reflect on what you've learned, and you learn to participate in science. You learn to use the tools of science. But when you think about learning science in informal environments outside of school, now we have to highlight the excitement piece. You don't learn anything if you're not excited. That's actually true in school as well, but we notice it more in the informal environment. The other thing you do is you learn that you can develop an identity as a science learner. I heard a presentation earlier, I guess last week, about the Science Academy that's held here at Fábrica. And one of the things that was explicit there was that the kids leave here a week knowing that they can learn science, right? That's part of learning, is learning that you can learn science. Because all of you are here because you like science or are interested in science communication. And all of you have had the experience, I'm guessing, maybe I should ask this as a question, right? Have you had the experience where you are at a party, it's noisy, alcohol may or may not be involved, and someone says, "What do you do?" And you say, "Oh, I study chemistry," or "I'm a physicist." And they go, "Oh, that's nice. Boy, the football season next year, that's going to be really interesting," right? Those are people who think they can't learn science. So a really important part of learning informal science in informal environments is learning that you can learn science. And this becomes part of the routine. So again, my family, my oldest son, his wife, both grandchildren, The photo was actually taken by one of my other sons who was visiting them. This is in Yosemite National Park in California. If you ever get a chance to go there, go there. It is one of the world's great locations. But what was interesting to me is what my son, the caption that he put when he posted it. So in case you can't read it, it says, "A family tradition, stopping to read every sign." This is how my children tease me, right? I can't go, you'll see later what I mean, but I stop at every sign. We'll be driving down the highway, there's a historical sign, gotta go read the sign, right? So that becomes part of the tradition where they are learning. For them, yes, they're on a walk in nature, but they're also stopping to learn. As I said, you'll see. So yesterday was a beautiful day, and I rented a bicycle, and I rode all the way around the lagoon. My legs are sore. But as you can see, I stopped to read signs, right? About environmental issues. So I thought I was going out just to have a beautiful day to do some sightseeing. But because there were signs there, I could learn things about the environment, about the region, and so on. And this sign, most people were just out to walk or to ride. This sign was particularly interesting. It was telling me about one of the little canals. And it told me that that canal had been widened at one time for particular commercial purposes. And all of a sudden, this is not a natural environment that I'm seeing. This is a very carefully constructed environment that's tied to the economic needs of the region and how that has changed over time, how some of these canals filled in, and lately, as some of the other places I stopped, you see them they've been rebuilt in recent years, and so on. So the point being here that this distinction between, was I out for a bike ride? Was I learning about the environment? Was I learning about the history and geography of the Aveiro region? All of those things mixed together. So was it public engagement? Was it science communication? Was it learning science in informal environments? Yes, it was. And so this is where we sort of end up when we're trying to think about those different terms, which is that they are different. We can point to some slight differences between them, but in the real world, they overlap. In the real world, whether we call it science communication or public communication of science, or learning science in informal environments, or public engagement, as scholars, there's some little differences we want to pick at. But if we think about what happens in the world, those things overlap. And the same thing can accomplish multiple purposes as well. So one of our challenges, if we want to talk about the past and the future of science public engagement, is to understand how we got to this overlap and what some of the implications are for the future. So now I'm going to transition and talk about sort of a theoretical model about how we can think about science communication. Probably most of you, this is roughly the way you think about science communication. You do work in the lab or out in the field, you prepare a paper, maybe you present it at a meeting, send it off to a preprint server, you write some grants. Eventually it gets published in a journal. And then it's science. Right? You don't think of it as science until it's in that formal paper. And only then do you think, does it go out into media, traditional media, social media, electronic? Does it go to textbooks? Does it go to policy documents? What some people would say is that the stuff on this side is cutting edge, it's the new stuff. the stuff on this side is packed down knowledge. That's something one of my professors called it. And that the public engagement is all over on this side. That I see people taking pictures. The problem is this image is wrong. Because when you actually start trying to track information and see what people do in the science community, it gets a lot messier. Don't try to follow any particular arrow. In fact, information flows in lots of different directions. We still have work in the lab in the field and preprints and journals, but that work that was presented in the lab maybe also got presented at a meeting and there was a reporter there. And so it goes out to the news media. Or maybe you are someone, on Saturday, I was very lucky, I went to go spend the day in Coimbra. I did not get to the botanical garden, unfortunately. I didn't have enough time, spent too much time talking with my friends. But if you do lab work or field work, especially in something like a botanical garden, the work you're doing is immediately available to the public that comes and visits, right? And so you might have visitors to a park or a botanical garden, and they take what they learned, or maybe they saw it on a website, and then it goes into their public discourse. They talk to their friends at a party. Did you see, I was at the park last week. Did you see that new plant that they're trying? Or they were talking about how they breed and new ways of breeding and things like that. It didn't go through the journal. It got there in another way, fairly directly from the science. Scientists who are good and who choose to collaborate, I don't mean that that's what makes them good, but scientists who collaborate with the media, who talk to reporters, or maybe are part of a documentary that's being made about the work they're doing in their lab. Some of that work gets presented in video or in a media story, and it's still in progress, and it's already part of the discussion. So this much messier system, I call this the web of science communication. I used to call it the web of science communication. I came up with that word in 1992, just before the thing that we now call the web became popular. So I now call it the sphere of science communication. You can barely see, there's an X and X, Y, and a Z axis in there. One of these days, I'll find someone to help me draw that as an actual sphere. But when you think of science communication as this much richer, much more diverse set of activities, now publication is all part of it. And yes, some of the cutting edge stuff is a little bit more on this side, and some of the packed down stuff is a little bit more on this side. But you don't want to be drawing real sharp distinctions, because some of the things that happen on this side, like policy documents, have a direct impact and come before whatever happens on this side. So funding decisions about what space missions or what technological initiatives or scientific initiatives we'll have, those things all get drawn in together. So we want to think about science communication as this, and public engagement in this much richer context. Everybody with me so far? Okay, now we'll finally get to the past. Now we'll finally start talking a little bit about the history of public engagement and where these different lines come from and how they intersect. Some of the most basic and some of the most famous and some of the most long-standing are public lectures by prominent scientists. All right? Most famously, the Christmas lectures at the Royal Institution in the UK, initially started by Michael Faraday. Speaking, oops. No, wait a second, there we go. Speaking here, one of these figures, probably this one, is Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband. This being a very important occasion, right? Lectures by scientists are important occasions. As I said, they still go on today. So this is from a couple of years ago. It looks about the same, doesn't it? Right? Yeah, a little more colored lights, but otherwise about the same. This is an environmental public lecture just a couple of years ago in Australia. It also looks about the same, including the throne, right, that the speaker is sitting on. There's a language to this. There are symbols involved here about the expert speaking with the public, and working out ideas. One could even say that's what I'm doing right now, right? But I don't want to think of myself on a throne. So there's that tradition. There's the museum tradition, not the science center tradition, but the museum tradition, where as early as the beginning of the 19th century, a museum was partly, even a museum intended for the public, was partly a way for demonstrating scientific knowledge. So Peale's Museum was the first public museum in the United States, intended to be a business and deliberately organized according to the Linnaean system of classification, using that idea as the way to think about ideas, which meant that he had to be talking with scientists, and scientists had to be themselves working out what exactly goes where. So it was a place to begin to work out knowledge. Many museums in the world began not as places for public display, but as places for collecting knowledge and for making sense out of that knowledge. In the US, the Smithsonian Institution at the top was its original documents that it was a place for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. So the increase was the do research, figure out new things, and only then diffuse it. So it was that linear model, but they ended up being mixed. Similarly, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, very famous as one of the great natural history museums of the world, with huge dinosaur exhibits. But those exhibits were produced for the purpose of understanding dinosaurs, not for display. Except they were done for display at the same time. They were places, the process of creating the display was the process of creating that knowledge. Some of the great dioramas that with painted backgrounds were partly about trying to work out what would the weather have looked like in that location and so forth. So that business of mixing of the producing and the explaining of knowledge go together. Another part of the tradition comes from the education model and includes the fact that you needed to have both education but entertainment as well. So in the United States, as you know, we're a very large country physically. And as public schooling grew in the middle of the 19th century, a lot of times there wasn't a real school. There would be a lecturer, a teacher who would move from place to place and would get paid depending on how many people he, and it was usually a he, attracted, which meant that he had to be entertaining. So any of you who've done chemistry demonstrations where you have smoke bubbling and things turning different colors, that tradition comes initially from that education world of trying to get people interested. So there was always this tension between providing information and providing a spectacle. Similarly with magazines that were created in the mid-1800s when printing became cheaper because of the rotary press, and you began to get what we call in English the penny press. So instead of paying, I'll put it in modern terms, €1 or €5 for a magazine, you pay a few cents because it could be much cheaper. Magazines for inventors. The Scientific American that is world famous began as an inventor's magazine. Already 150, 200 years ago, we had public participating in the scientific research process. A US Navy captain named Matthew Fontaine Maury realized that ship's logs, sea captains kept, have very detailed weather information. Every hour, a ship would record where it was and what the weather was. And so he created a form for ship captains to send that information in, and it was compiled, and it created these charts to show at this time of year, in this location, what is the likelihood of the wind being this strength from that direction, so that ship captains could plan their trips, but also so that Maury could begin to understand the circulation of the weather. And he published a very famous textbook called Physical Geography of the Sea, one of the first oceanography texts. There's a whole separate, very different kind of story to tell about Maury. He was a Southerner. He went with the South with the Civil War in the United States, and mainstream scientists wrote him out of the picture. So it's a very interesting story. We also had weather observers, again, all across the country, beginning in the late 19th century, where ordinary people would write down the weather and send it in, and that became the early ways of creating weather maps in the United States. So this tradition of having publics participate has been here for a long time. Public health, right? We're very conscious of it now. I see a lot of masks in front of me. But that required a lot of public communication. And in the early part of the 20th century, campaigns for hygiene, for getting inoculations against or vaccinations against diphtheria, for clean water, for not spitting so that they wouldn't spread tuberculosis. All of that was there were major campaigns, and this came about at about the same time that the modern public information or public relations profession was developed. So the techniques of how to speak to publics and how to identify particular publics grew up at the same time in public health and in marketing and selling, right? So this was all part of the same time. It's only around then, so say 1920, that we begin to get a sort of specialization in what today we would call science communication. So the first people who you can see science stories earlier, but the first people who would call themselves science journalists or science writers, for the most part, came about around the 1920s. And you begin to get people thinking, oh, I could have this as a profession. This guy, E.E. Slauson, was a chemist who, I forget if he spent any time as a practicing chemist. He became a chemical educator. He wrote a very famous textbook called Creative Chemistry, and that was sent to every high school in the United States. And he became the first director of something called Science Service that produced news stories about science that would be circulated by telegraph to every newspaper in the country so that every newspaper could have science stories in it. That ended up being turned into a small magazine, initially called Science Newsletter, then Science News, that still exists today, and that is one of the most long-standing popular science magazines. We also have the growth of the great science museums of the world, not just natural history museums, but also ones that have technology in them. So the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, and the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia in the United States are two of the examples. Deutsches Museum in Munich fits the same category, founded also around this time, around the late 19th, early 20th century. And notice that I'm calling them temples. These are massive structures, right? These are designed to show the power of science. Yes, there's science in them, but the buildings themselves convey a message, right, about how important science is. We also, again, have these people who are now making a profession. So this is Voldemort Comfort. He was originally the editor of a popular science magazine. Then for a while, he was the founding director of the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. And then he spent 30 or 40 years as the science editor of the New York Times, essentially until he died in his 70s. Now the specialist historian in me comes out. Just recently, somebody found his personal papers and donated them to Cornell. I have a new research project. Do we have temples here in Portugal? Right? Okay, Fábrica is not a temple, but it's a pretty big warehouse. Right? It's a very large building you can see from a long way away. On the weekend when I was in Coimbra, I saw the chemistry laboratories there, and did I write it down? That was described in my tourist brochure. One of these, the tourist brochure that I got at the university was described as the most important Portuguese neoclassical building. It's not a coincidence. That building was designed to be an important building. And the redesign of it and the rebuilding of it was designed to make sure that science would be celebrated for the knowledge that it produces. And knowledge was produced in the museums as well. Books. Yet another line where we're thinking about where does this all come from. So these books are important because they were widely read by an educated public, about the one on computer science, power and human reason, the late E.O. Wilson's sociobiology. He just died recently, a couple of months ago. A book written by a journalist called Chaos, by James Glick. And what's important about these books is they were written as much for scientists as they were for a general public. They were a place for working out questions of knowledge. So Weizenbaum, who was a computer scientist and was trying to understand the early days of artificial intelligence and was trying to work out the ideas, not in his individual research papers, but in a broader scope of things. So he used a book that could be accessible to many people. Similarly, sociobiology, Wilson had done all of his detailed studies, and he pulls them together into this book, creates social controversy because of the questions that it raises about sociobiology, and so on. But it's both a technical book and it's a popular book, and it works out questions of knowledge. Chaos is interesting because Glick was a reporter who had seen a bunch of different kinds of studies in mathematics, in computer science, in evolution, and he saw a common theme and wrote about it and called it Chaos. And what we today would call chaos studies, he was pulled together partly around his book. Right? A field of chaos studies didn't really exist until his book existed. And various people saw, oh, the work I'm doing connects over this way and connects this way. And so we can see a role that a popular science books plays in the production of knowledge. Think again of my sphere, of where do the ideas come from? How do they move? And what role is public engagement playing in the production of knowledge? We also have what I first heard of with a French term, culture scientifique. This is one of those places where translation doesn't work. If I were to say scientific culture in English, it doesn't really have any meaning. It might mean the culture within a scientific laboratory or within a scientific field. But the idea of culture scientifique in French is much more about we live in a culture which is suffused by science. Science is present everywhere. I'm not quite clear what the term means in Portuguese. I've asked a couple of times in the last week. Nobody's quite been comfortable giving me a full answer. So afterwards, you can comment on that. But these are the things, these are popular books or plays that are, you wouldn't say you were an educated person if you had not looked at Hawking's Brief History of Time. You might not have read it all the way through. Most people didn't. But it was always on your coffee table. Or you talked about the play Copenhagen and the questions of uncertainty that it introduces into our general conversation. It's part of our cultural discussion to have these things play a part. I mentioned public participation in scientific research. Today we call that by many names. Citizen science is one of them. I just learned while preparing these slides that next month, April, is Citizen Science Month. So there's opportunities there. There's lots of places to get resources. Again, this is a current thing, but it comes out of this long tradition of having people participate in the scientific process. As the idea of the temples suggests, all of this is built on an idea, or not all of it, much of it is built on the idea believing that science is tied to progress. It's part of how we move ahead as a society. This is the image at the beginning of a book published in the 1930s called Man in a Chemical World. I'm sorry for the sexism, that's the title. The caption for this photo, chemical industry, that's the man like this, upheld by pure science, so the beautiful woman in blue is pure science, sustains the production of man's necessities. So science sustains industry, and that's what we need in order to live. That's the vision of what science is. That's the popular vision of what science is. But there have always been concerns, right? The idea that science and technology are moving too fast, that they are introducing problems in our world. In the 1930s, Charlie Chaplin was making the movie Modern Times. The world is going too fast and technology is the problem. The 1960s and 70s, the growth of the environmental movement, the sense that somehow science had introduced all these issues of pollution that we were having to deal with. Again, nuclear weapons, the problems of nuclear war, and how to, whether we could even survive a nuclear war. Again, problems that are back with us, literally back with us today. These problems have been there. In the 1930s, there were calls for a science holiday. We should stop doing science so that we could catch up with how we think about science. This is not new ideas. Today, we see that, or in the last 25 years, we've seen that with genetic technologies, genetic engineering, worries about our food, worries about who's controlling our food, and so forth. We see it with big issues, climate change, vaccines, evolution, people worried about it. Where does it fit into theories of belief, into our understanding of how our economies work and our need for energy and so forth. Vaccines, obviously with COVID and so forth. And we also see how these problems intersect with other kinds of social issues. So in the United States, one of our challenges with getting people, we're all jealous of Portugal and your admiral who just got you all to get vaccinated. We have massive resistance to vaccines. It's very much tied to politics in some cases, but in other cases, it's tied to history. So in the African American community in the United States, they are much less likely to get vaccinated because, for good historical reasons, again, I bring in other social issues are important. For good historical reasons, African Americans are very suspicious of the medical establishment. There is real evidence that the medical establishment has done bad things to the African American community. So they are very resistant when a doctor says, you should get vaccinated. Yeah, you're going to put something in me? Right? So these things become very complicated. So ultimately, these are all examples of what are called wicked problems, these modern challenges. And wicked problems, almost all of which show up in the UN sustainable goals, are problems where they're unique. Something like climate change isn't like anything else. Something like vaccines really isn't like anything else. There's no one way to define exactly what the problem is. Is climate change about food security, or is it about energy security, or is it about geography and the dangers of living in various places? Different people will define the problem in different ways. You'll never know whether you've solved the problem. There's no point when you can say we've solved the problem with a wicked problem. It's also rarely possible to test a solution. Well, let's see if this will solve climate change. And if it doesn't work, we'll do something else. Well, first off, you don't know what works because you don't know what the end point is. So there's a real challenge this way. And often there's not really a right or a wrong. There's just some ways are better or worse. So you can make lots of lists of wicked problems. I made this one initially a few years ago. I had to revise it recently, right, because of COVID. Suddenly the question about vaccines and autism intersected with the issues of COVID. But there's all these others. You'll notice I've added digital agriculture at the bottom. That's a topic that I've just recently become involved in and looking at. The list goes on and on of wicked problems in the world, ones where it's very difficult for us to know what it would even mean to solve these problems. So as we come near the end, I come back to my bike ride. Right? And those signs, and the fact that that those signs were pointing to some broader issues. They talked very briefly about sort of environmental problems in the Laguna, but they didn't give me much detail. If I look, I can find research articles. As it happened on Saturday night, I had dinner with another visiting Fulbright specialist, Angus Kingon from Brown University, who's here working in CSEC with Professor, I can't say her name easily, Professor Valerino, on a system to think about how we can monitor various factors, pollution-related factors and other factors in the estuaries and in the ocean. And what I'm suggesting with wicked problems is we can't do this just with science. We have to have a public engagement about what are the issues and how do these things connect with economic issues in the region, and how do they connect with broader international global issues. We were, the fishermen who might be gathering data might not be from Portugal, they might be from other places. How would that fit in, and so forth. So that we're going to get to the place where we have to have these kinds of public discussions of the kind that I referred to earlier. So we have public engagement, we have this overlap, we can actually overlap them. You can see I like really messy diagrams, things that you can't interpret, because I think the world is a messy place, right? And I think public engagement, by having more people involved in all of those different kinds of public engagement, is part of how we as a society, as a global international society, can try to address these issues. So that brings me to the future. What does the future of public engagement look like? I'm a historian. I don't do the future. So I don't have a whole lot to say about this. Just that I think we're going to keep having wicked problems. And that's part of where we need to be focusing on. I think we are going to have to do more dialogue. That might mean less display, because we have limited resources, right? But that we should be putting efforts into dialogue. I think we have to recognize these complex social dimensions, these different ways, things that are part of our issues. I think there is plenty of need for research on public engagement. I also think there is plenty of room for practice of public engagement. Obrigado. So I believe we now have time for questions. And I don't know how you want to manage that.
Não sei se alguém tem uma questão.
Thank you so much, Bruce. My name is Annabelle, and I have a question about social media, because it's changing a lot the way we communicate. It's a big challenge for companies, for organizations, and even for scientists.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you facing that? Because if you see the data, like YouTube is like of most popular websites in the world and also in Portugal. And well, so it's the challenge because if we see like new generation, they are in front of the screen all the time. So how can we talk with this new generation, a TikTok generation, Instagrammer generation? So I don't know if, in your opinion, in your experience, so maybe science communication is working on this kind of video article, and do you think it's good or not? Because I think there are two hands in this dangerous way as well. But yeah, my question is about this changing of communication way to speak, to approach community and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an important question. You're absolutely right. That's where a lot of communication happens. Many of you are much more comfortable with these social media than I am. I think I figured out what TikTok is. I actually have a graduate student who I'm advising. I'm not her major advisor. She's a doing some kind of nutrition research, but she's trying to build public communication of science into her regular set of activities. And what she's done is created a TikTok specifically about life as a graduate student in nutrition. Because storytelling, we know from research in communication, that's one of the best ways to get to people's minds. Most people don't want to sit and listen to a lecture. They want to hear a story. And that's how we as humans, neurologically, it's how we remember things, is with stories. So, although Elba can correct me on that. And so using YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or whatever new thing comes along next is a tool we have to learn how to use. And some of that comes from understanding what works. Some of that might come from experimenting with new ways of using social media. Some of it comes from recognizing the challenges that it has. The issues of, is it oversimplifying or something? Those are the same issues science writers have been dealing with for 100 years. So that's not a new problem. We still have tools that we've learned for doing it, but we do have to learn how to respond to the misinformation. Is it better? For example, we know now that it's better not to repeat misinformation before you give the right answer, because that actually reinforces the bad information. So we have to learn how to deal with that in things. The picture that I had up there about vaccines was two comedians called Penn and Teller, who made a short video showing how vaccines work, and essentially showing, no, it doesn't fully protect you, but it protects you a lot more than not having a vaccine. And so on. So being creative, and that's a creative speed. So now we start talking about working with other kinds of creatives, visual artists, sound artists, experience artists, people who do have events in the moment. How do we take advantage of all those other skills? We have to bring them to bear on the issue. So I think it's critical that we take on social media. We're just now beginning to do research specifically about science on social media. There are people studying science on YouTube. I've seen a paper about science on TikTok, but especially if anybody's looking for a research topic, it's there for you. I should also say, if somebody is more comfortable asking a question in Portuguese, feel free to do that. We have plenty of people here who can help translate.
My name is Ruth, and I'm a PhD student. And following on that question, I would just like to share that, yes, we need to be on social media for sure, because this new generation consumes social media and it's always looking for information on social media. So the best way to fight fake news is to have real news on social media. And that's what I've been doing, and also my colleague here. She is in a project, I think that she can talk a little bit about it. And I do what you were saying that your student does, which is to share my daily life in the lab. I'm a chemist, and people started to follow. And now I truly believe that it is what you were saying about dialogue. People want to be part of the dialogue. They just don't want to see me showcase anything anymore or some information. They want to interact and give their opinion and start a conversation.
Go ahead, yeah.
I can talk later, don't worry.
So what you've highlighted is it's social media. Right? Let's not think about the media part. Let's think about the social part. It is that interaction. And it's great that you're doing that and doing that. And that's traditionally been something that scientists are uncomfortable with, interacting with broader publics. That's not as true now as it used to be. Some of you have heard me tell this story before. I teach a weekend-long, just 2-day, 3-day workshop for graduate students in the sciences about introduction to science communication. And the first time I taught that course about 15 years ago, there were about 40 people in the room. And I said, how did you hear about this? Did you see a flyer? Did you get an email about it? How many of you did your advisors say, hey, here's something you might be interested in? About half the hands in the room went up. And then I said, how many people are afraid that your advisor is going to find out you're here? And the other half of the hands went up. Today, when I now ask that question every time I teach the course, and I get one half hand. One person, their advisor maybe isn't wild that they're there, but there's been a shift. It's a generational shift in the attitude about scientists themselves being part of that social conversation. It is younger people typically who are doing that. And I think that's really critical, and that's part of what has to happen.
Well, I can ask you a question. Basically, me and 7 other girls started a project about communicating science. We started with all this COVID situation and so on, and we started making videos of 3 minutes. And now we're realizing that sometimes it's even hard to people to just see a video with 3 minutes. And one question that is basically the first slide that you show about the article about communicating in different languages. What do you think from the 2 visits that you already did to Portugal? What do you think about communicating in Portuguese versus communicating in English? I don't know if you have any opinion on that.
I do. I think it needs to be done in Portuguese and in English, and in Spanish, and in Tagalog in the Philippines, and all the different dialects of Portuguese. I've been talking with people about this week. So in a communication course, the single most important thing that we teach is to pay attention to your audience. Everything begins with even what you decide to talk about begins with your audience. Doesn't matter what you think is important. It's what your audience thinks is important. You have to start there, connecting with the audience. And if your audience speaks Portuguese, then you need to be talking in Portuguese. And you can't reach 8 billion people in the world anyway. So pick your audience. Pick the audience that you're going to go for, and use the techniques that will get to them, where they are, the language they speak, the cultural references that will make sense to them. If I say Coimbra in the United States, somebody would say, excuse me, right? If I say it in Portugal, people, right, the place of the oldest university in Europe is. And so there's a meaning that that happens there, and you have to draw on those kinds of tropes. I don't know enough about the culture of YouTube or TikTok or anything. If there are variations there that can be attributed to language, but if there are, I would use them, and absolutely think in those terms.
Hi, my name is David. I'm a geologist. Probably I get the past as wrong as historians do, but that's another question.
I started as a geology major.
Okay. I was thinking about my question, and actually it interlinks with the first question, the second, third question, the third one, and it comes a lot with the way we can pass on the message, and the public actually gets the concept, which sometimes is a challenge. Now we have social media, which is a big tool for younger generations. They're the main consumers. I'm not saying that older people won't do it, but still in many outreach events, we still have the older people. And I came to situations where we had the kids, the teenager who wanted to go to the event. They was interested in the science or whatever you're displaying. And the mom or dad were just there because they went with him. They really didn't, oh yeah, I don't understand the science. I don't get this. But you try to explain, and then sometimes you need to get the bridge to make them understand the concept a bit better. In my case, it's food, and you just mentioned the culture, and I think in Portugal everybody just loves food too much and makes the analogy with food. Because when I'm in the, and again, and also comes with the place where you are doing your activities. I mean, with the table it's fine. You have your tools, you select your experiments, what's most representative. When you're on a field trip, the field trips are very good because people are there with a reason. They want to be there, and they pay probably more attention, and there's a predisposition to go there. But you're explaining that, yes, that's a rock and it folded. How the hell that hard thing just got like that? You use food. Instead of, it's like, oh yeah, this deposited and piled up, blah, blah, blah. Just talk of pastry and cream and whatever, and then you just mush it, and you get these simple examples, and you can get the switch from this hard concept of a scientific experiment or something into something that they actually grasp. And sometimes that's an issue. Some people may disagree with me or not, but it goes back again to your scientific, what was the name in French?
Culture scientifique.
Culture scientifique, right? How much of the science is entrained in society? In Portugal, probably there's not that much, or it's probably more in some areas than others. When I said, like, I'm going to be a geologist when I was in high scholl. A what? A biologist? No, Mr. So you see,
Yeah.
This is one example. This is my experience, and I've found that sometimes I have to get these tools to make them understand, and once they get it, probably it's easy to just go into the future. You see, sometimes you need the base to go.
Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, this is where the part of where the creative piece comes from. Some of the things like social media lets you use visual issues more, or graphics or so on, in other ways, and so you can bring that in. The metaphors, the comparisons you make, making those be culturally relevant, are clearly there. And recognizing that it takes time to produce those. I remember a friend of mine who was a newspaper, a science editor at a newspaper, who wrote he had the best metaphors. When I teach writing metaphors, all of my examples come from him because he's just great. The one I'm remembering right now is, its name is Bond, chemical bond. And I asked him how he comes up with that. He said he spends hours just sitting at his keyboard. He knows the idea he's trying to get across, and he just has to keep trying variations and variations. What's interesting is I spent a couple of years early in my career before I became an academic writing advertisements, working for an advertising agency. And that's the same thing we did in the ad agency. I was paid to sit there and come up with different ways of saying the same thing and which one would grab your attention. That takes time. If you're trying to be a cutting edge researcher and you're already spending 18 hours a day in the lab, where's that time going to come from? And that's where we then have the practitioners, right? More practice. It's why we need people who choose this as their career or deliberately have their jobs designed to have that be part of their career, is that it takes a lot of effort. Some people it comes easily, some people it's harder, some of it we can teach, some of it, as we know, some people just have this ability to produce things that others don't. Don't ask me to draw anything. I think we have to take that variation and pay attention to it and devote the resources that it takes to produce them. And at the next line up, the researchers understand how people understand different metaphors. What happens if you have different choices? Do some of them, is one better or worse, or is one better for one audience and the other one better for another audience? And how do we think about that? So I think there's a lot to be done in that area.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Nope, I think,
Yeah. Yes. I think my
no,
No.
yeah.
yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think my question comes to the other way of the previous questions, but I would like to know if there is a common sense regarding what is the role that this science communication through social media plays. Because personally, I don't think social media is the right way to teach people. And for me, it would work more as a marketing tool for science.
Mhm.
But I don't know how academia sees that, and I would like to know that, if you know.
Yeah. So I think you're right. I mean, this is one of the challenges, is that different modes will achieve different things. And that's part of why we have to think about this overlap of different tools. Yes, social media, you're not going to teach someone in a 20-second TikTok the same thing that you're going to teach them in a 45-minute lecture. I can't imagine trying to take this talk and make a what would you do? What would the TikTok of my lecture today be? It's an interesting exercise, actually. I have to think about that. But maybe by getting someone interested in the daily life of a chemistry student, there's a link there so they can follow it to a longer story, or to a different version, or to a video that explains that particular process or so on. Again, we're not going to get to everybody with everything, but what we're trying to do is provide as many different places and different ways for someone who's excited about something to be able to follow up, to pick up on their interest, so on. My poor family, they're used to the fact that they are characters in my lectures. My middle son was interested in elephants from the time he was a year old, because the stuffed toy that he carried with him every place was an elephant. So when he was a boy, my wife and I, we bought him books about elephants, and we took him to the zoo so he could see elephants. When he was about 10, there was a lecture on campus about elephants, and I took him there, and he got all excited. When he was about 11, I was going to a meeting in South Africa, and he came with me. I took him with me so he could see real elephants in the safari and so on. Then he became a teenager. He didn't pay attention to anything I wanted him to pay attention to. When he was about 15, I was at the mall, the shopping mall, in February. And the booth that sells calendars, if you haven't bought a calendar by February, you're not going to, so they take them away. And anything they have, they're selling for $1. I was there getting something else. I bought him an elephant calendar. I gave it to him when I got home. Thanks, Dad. The next morning, he came down and he says, Dad, I was looking at that calendar and I realized I hadn't read anything about elephants in a while. So I went on Wikipedia and I was reading all about elephants. And do you remember a long time ago, you took me to some lecture on campus, some lady was talking about elephants? Do you think I could volunteer in her lab or something? I knew the director of her lab. Oh, sure, let's see. So in the end, so he volunteered for her lab for his last year or two of high school. He was planning on a sort of taking government and politics in college and university. He ended up doing international relations with an environmental focus, partly tied to that. Now he's in politics, but you never know which of those things is going to grab someone's attention and at what point in their life. And so again, we have this, was that calendar, was that science communication or public engagement? I don't know, but it certainly wasn't learning, except that it kept him excited and led to him making a further step along the way. So part of this, and this actually does get to the culture scientifique idea, is having all of these different opportunities available, including the opportunities to talk about the challenges, including the opportunities to talk about what will we do about pollution, what will we do about water quality, what will we do about vaccines. And one of the challenges we face in the United States with vaccines is that part of our culture is the commitment to individual rights in the United States. It's part of what makes us a great place. It's part of what drives the entrepreneurial spirit in the United States and so on. It has a dark side. People don't pay attention to the community interest, right? So they don't go get vaccines. So how do we draw on those different cultural pieces so that we can tie various parts of our culture together and make science available in there to talk about vaccines and individual rights and political goals and community responsibility? You need to have lots of different places for talking about that. So I agree you can't do it all in a short thing, but I think that's one of the ways that we can get in to other places.
We are finishing. I think we can have one or two more questions. Okay, we have one.
Hi, my name is Monica. I am fashion design teacher. And I want to ask you about the traditional education. With the pandemic situation, education changed a lot, and teachers and students have many possibilities and many change, many freedom. What do you think about come back to the traditional way for the education, to the classroom, to a place, to going back to the same thing? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think like everybody else, so my children are all grown, so I didn't have to deal with children at home. That sounds terrible. And I was teaching college students who all have computers and know how to use them. So there are differences. But clearly, I don't think we will ever go back completely to the old ways, because we have learned that there are some things we can do better online, right? We can have some of these demonstrations that are perhaps dangerous or difficult to do in a classroom, but we can have them easily available. And where before we might have shown a video of the demonstration, now we know how to do it live, right? I believe I'm being live streamed right now. I'm not doing a chemical demonstration, but we could, so that the kids could ask questions right in the middle. What's going on there? How about this opportunity? What if you did it that color? So that we can take advantage of the technology that we've all become, or many of us have become more comfortable with. Not everybody. And there are inequalities in society, and not everybody has access to the technology. I don't want to forget that piece. It's easy to forget it, but we have to remember to think about that as well. But we can draw on some of those to enhance what we do, both for formal education and for informal education. So using some of those, so when I was at the Science Museum in Coimbra, which was a lovely museum, I really enjoyed it. It had both historical stuff and modern interactives, sometimes side by side. What if you had a scientist on call available there, that if someone were to say, I see this interactive, I see this historical piece, I don't completely understand how they fit together. Push this button to talk to a scientist and ask a question. And there was somebody who was available to help explain some of that. And somebody who didn't have it couldn't be a pre-recorded answer because it would depend on what the audience, the student, the informal learner at that moment wanted to know, right? So you can imagine ways that we could be creative. This will cost money, it will cost time, it will cost resources. But I think there's the opportunity for us to take some of the skills and tools that we've developed during COVID, during the pandemic, to adapt to new ways and to experiment. Again, think about some of the social media things that have happened, and is there ways to turn some of those into longer stories? I don't know.
Okay, we have a last question or comment, I don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here, for entertaining us, for communicating, discussing communication of science, which is of course the best way to do it. As a co-founder of this place, I'm very proud of your contribution to this life of Fábrica itself. But I have many questions I could, of course, address. Very simple question I would like you to comment. Nowadays, and we are connected to a PhD on history of science, but in terms of normal first degree, very little to say no history of science is present at our curricula. So I would like you to comment on that, to compare the situation in the United States, and also to link that with, of course, if you don't learn about history of science, how can you have a perspective of communicating science and, of course, bring about public engagement to the science? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here at Fábrica. I'm glad to be with someone who helped create it. It's a wonderful place. Yeah, I'm a historian of science. Of course, I think history is important. So I think it's important in a couple of different ways. One is, in general, providing context, helping us understand, but also, in particular, helping us understand the social interactions that are fundamental to science. Science does not exist by itself. It exists in a social matrix where funding decisions are made based on politics. Politics has been part of funding science. There are examples going back to Galileo. When Galileo first looked at the skies, he found 3 moons, rather. The problem was that his funder, the Medici brothers, there were 4 of them. And he didn't announce his findings until he had found a 4th moon. Doesn't mean that he made up a 4th moon, but when he found a 4th moon, he said, now I can announce, right? So politics and funding have been part of science forever. And we need to recognize that and acknowledge that. And history helps us tell that story. History is also full of stories. And as I said earlier, stories are part of how we learn. And so this can be one of the ways that we help people see why was someone trying to solve a particular problem. You can do this in chemistry a lot because a lot of chemistry is driven by industrial problems. Where do different dye colors come from? And why are they interested in chemistry? And it's in part tied to their of what people were trying to accomplish then. So we can use history to tell stories. There is a danger, and I'm a little bit guilty of it in what I did today, which is that I used history to talk about the present. And you have to be careful because things were happening for different reasons in history than they happen now. So some historians don't like the fact, and they are correct, that I use history to talk about current issues. So I have to be a little bit careful here. The education stream was about different things than the early public participation in scientific research. And it was happening in a different context. I mentioned Matthew Fontaine Maury and his complicated place in US history and how that's tied to his complicated legacy in the scientific community. So we have to be able to deal, but history helps us talk about those complexities in a way that if we were just to say, this is how a modern pilot chart came about, we wouldn't be able to do. So I think it's really important to use history. As I said, at Coimbra, it was wonderful to see these things right next to each other and to try to see the old instruments and the new instruments, and very interesting. I was visiting Coimbra with a former postdoc of mine. She worked with me on a project 15 years ago on social and ethical issues in nanotechnology. And her job during that work was to be in the nanofabrication laboratory, working directly alongside the scientists and helping them have conversations about social and ethical issues. And as we were, one of the slides I didn't show, I was thinking of it, was when we were in the museum, there's a place where the wall is broken into and you can see what today we would call a chemical fume hood. And it was really funny because she pointed at, she said, this is the old version of what I was doing when I was in the nano lab, was this. So we could see these connections. She got excited, which surprised me.
Okay, we are on time. I know that there are more questions.
I'm glad to answer questions later.
I also had a question related to Science Center, but I'm not going to put it because we are in a Science Center and we have colleagues from the Ciência Science Center of Coimbra. But we can put more questions and discuss with Bruce in the coffee break. We have a splendid coffee break, and also the opening of the new exhibition, photo exhibition called Flying High Again, photographies by Sávio Figueira Correia, that is here with us, postdoc in the University of Aveiro, in history of physics, and also collaborating with us here in Fábrica. So don't go away. It's a good opportunity to have some more meeting, networking, chat with Bruce. And thank you again for coming here. And Bruce, thank you again for this splendid open talk.
Obrigado. Thank you.